Hello everyone, welcome back to the lecture series Algorithmic Sustainable Design, the Future of Architectural Theory. This is our 8th lecture in the series. Today I would like to cover several topics: emergent systems, examples from artificial life, inhuman experiments, and architectural education. Those of you who have been following my lectures will have noticed that current architectural education and practice are opposite to the method presented in my lectures. So it's about time I discuss this as an important point. It's important to point out that the established system of practice and education is not integral with natural and biological systems. What I have been talking about in this series of lectures is how to integrate architecture with natural and biological systems. Therefore, if we want sustainability, then my lectures provide the most helpful direction. And the aim of today's lecture is to try to analyze the reasons for the mismatch between what is currently popular and what is currently being taught in schools and the content of my lectures, which reflects not only my own work, but a vast volume of work done by my friends and colleagues. To begin with, I want to discuss emergent systems, but in a very specific application. I want to apply systems theory to explain some phenomena of human society. There's no need for us to know systems theory. It is just a study of collections of components that interact together. And what we do know is that for very complex systems, there is a phenomenon of emergence. Systems tend to develop new characteristics that are not present in the initial inputs. This occurs with any mechanical systems, any study of systems, economic systems, abstract systems. But what I want to focus upon today is human societies. A system of beliefs can be taken to be the components of a system, and then those system of beliefs interact and grow over time and can eventually take over a society. We have many examples of that throughout history. As social contagion can spread the new norm that people follow. So this is the scenario of the application of systems theory to society. The introduction of an ideology and often questionable beliefs, if they are successful in a society, can lead to the emergence of a power structure. The power structure is not there in the beginning. The power structure develops as an emerging phenomenon. When that happens, then the system grows in strength and detaches itself from the rest of the world. The system itself becomes more and more insular, which is isolated from the rest of the world. And the reason being, this is a natural response of a system that wants to protect itself and protect its power structure. We observe in such systems of power, social systems of power, we observe periodic attempts at reform, but those are really not attempts at genuine reform. If it is driven from the inside, it is not reform at all. But it is just a carefully staged attempt to perpetuate the existing power structure. And I don't need to remind you of well-publicized political attempts at reform that are just merely staged deceptions. Most of this was already seen by George Orwell and expressed in his novel 1984, which is a rather bleak picture of a society where a totalitarian system has taken total control, and these are the techniques that are used then in order to maintain that total control of society. Let me go through them. First of all, the past is erased so that the system forces people to live in the present. Power is expressed by inflicting pain. Totalitarian systems are very cruel. Reality is defined only by the system. There is no other truth to turn towards. So you have a single reality, and that is defined by the system. And the power system then rewrites history so that one cannot even turn towards other realities of the past. All history is rewritten in order to reflect the reality of the system. This is a very doomsday picture that George Orwell painted, but it is helpful in understanding what we have to do here. Therefore, a movement based on ideas can turn into an institutional power base when those ideas successfully permeate, and this has nothing to do with the value of those ideas. It has to do merely with the success those ideas have in catching into the society. When irrational ideas are transformed into established practice, those ideas become rational. This is an important point to emphasize. When you look at an idea in the abstract sense, you can say this idea is total nonsense. It is irrational. But if that idea has been put into practice and is supported by a society and by the laws of that society, then it becomes rational by definition. And therefore, from that point on, the system's goal is simply to perpetuate the existing power structure by all available means. Now, applying some of these ideas to the development of certain concepts in a system of architectural education. For the last century or so, our system of architectural education has concentrated upon abstract forms. It is a style-based design method, and the style-based design method is detached from biological needs and from nature, which is what I'm teaching in this course. That's why we find a conflict between what I am teaching and what is being taught in the majority of architecture schools. Furthermore, design as taught today in the majority of architecture schools is detached from spiritual needs. All in all, we can conclude that there is no or very little integrity with humanity. Well, as you can see, I'm extremely unhappy with the state of events, so I would like to introduce different goals for architectural education, and here they are. Architectural education should be, the goal of architectural education should be to raise people's awareness of the effects of the built environment. It should also be to take responsibility for one's designs. Design should focus on the well-being of the inhabitants. And we have to get away from this obsession with coming up with novel shapes to the exclusion of everything else. There's nothing wrong with coming up with novel shapes. That's the whole purpose of architecture. But to concentrate strictly on that neglects the other main points here. And this is a controversial point, but I will throw it out to the audience anyway. Students should not be trained to become mindless pawns of a manipulative power system. And we have enough evidence to show that the growth of certain style-driven architecture has developed into a power system, and it does manipulate the media and the schools in order to maintain its control. Now I move on to the second aspect, the second portion of this lecture, artificial life. Most people think of artificial life as the pixels on a computer screen, and we have a certain algorithm that creates those pixels and a dynamic algorithm that moves them around. And we have interesting and complex forms that live in electronic space on the digital memory of the computer, and they move around or gobble up each other. And this is a game, and it's fascinating and interesting, and it's an innocent aspect of artificial life. There is a second aspect of artificial life which is alarming, however, and it's more down to earth. And that is the two-way transformation between living beings and machines. And that is extremely serious, because it has to do with us. It has to do with our existence as human beings. It has to do with our environment. It has to do with the 20th century. And I'm going to argue in the next few slides that the latter process, the two-way transformation between living beings and machines, has reshaped humanity in the 20th century. In order to do that, let me introduce a very simple model of the relationship between machines and living beings. There are two possible ways to go. Going up makes machines mimic capabilities of living beings, whereas going down reduces living beings to the characteristics of machines. I will try to argue that going down actually determines the form of the 20th century's built environment. Here's my diagram, going from living being to machine and vice versa, either going up to living beings or going down to machines. I will give some examples of the process of going up, which is to enhance machines to mimic biological and living qualities. One phenomenal success of going up is that computers vastly enhance our capabilities, calculational capabilities, manipulative capabilities. We have become dependent on computers for our daily life. That's a big plus for that machinery, because it helps humanity. A separate success is in robotics. First, I describe semi-autonomous robots, like the Mars Explorer, built by the robotics expert Rodney Brooks at MIT University. And these are small mobile robots that are semi-autonomous. You don't have to have a person guiding the Mars Explorer at every second. It has mobility, capability. These are marvels of machine evolution. The other type of robot is not a mobile robot, but a fixed robot. And an industrial robot can work in highly repetitive conditions that would tax the patience of any human worker. They can work in extremely delicate situations, on the micro scale, or very dangerous situations where radioactive environments, etc. So these are machines that help humanity because they can work in situations. Also, military robots are being applied as we speak to save human lives, because a military robot is more expendable than humans. But as we will see later, this is true only for an industrialized society. Some more qualities of going up, raising machines to the level closer to beings. We can add, and we have done so, we can add more and more intelligent qualities to machines so that they're able to mimic human capabilities. We increase the perceptive mechanisms. There's a tremendous advancement in computer vision, computer cognition. Those are being built into machines and robots in order to try to mimic vision, so we understand our own mechanism of vision better. We increase the capacity of these machines to process information, and we increase their autonomous action capability. So I have just described one of the 20th century's greatest advances in technology, which is to take machines and raise them up towards living beings and human beings in particular, and they have transformed our society for the better. Now, however, I'm going to look at the downside, which takes beings, whether animals or humans, and reduces them to the level of machines. First of all, the techniques by which this is done. brainwashing is a technique that reduces people to the level of machines, and brainwashing, of course, is applied by the military, but it's also the tool for advertising. And to anticipate some of my later discussion, I will point out that the architect Le Corbusier was a pioneer in advertising. He published the first advertising magazine which had the publicity photos of generators, sewing machines, etc. So he was an authority in advertising. Advertising is supposed to manipulate people as inert entities to buy things they don't need and that are possibly harmful for them. And the goal of advertising is to transform human beings into mechanical consumers of industrial products. Military brainwashing does things even worse. It can take humans and convince them to act as suicide bombers. And these are in societies where human beings are more expendable than very costly robots. So we see here the opposite phenomenon applied in going down. How do you reduce humans to the level of machines? Well, you remove more and more of their intelligent qualities. You decrease their perceptive mechanisms so that they are no longer able to see things that are obvious. You decrease their capacity for processing information so that they no longer are able to make comparisons and to make logical decisions. And you decrease their autonomous action capability so that they're no longer in complete control of their decisions. This is a very bleak picture, but I'm only reporting what we see in today's society. In many different aspects, human beings are reduced, and sometimes willfully, but other times simply as a byproduct of a consumerist society, or of a society that is trying to win a military conflict. It will reduce its citizens to machine level and throw them in front of oncoming forces from the other side. These are very difficult questions which I don't want to really get into. And instead, I will move into the industrialization of animals, leaving human beings behind. Animals become an industrial product. For example, battery-raised chickens pass all their lives cramped together in atrocious conditions. They're bred with growth hormones and genetically modified. They're made into unnatural monsters. And all of this is in order to boost industrialization. Laboratory animals are used in cruel and inhumane experiments, again to boost industrialization. And I'm afraid to say that you and I benefit from all this industrialization, because battery-fed chickens are much cheaper to buy and to cook than free-range chickens. So I'm not casting the blame on a particular group of people. All of our society is to be blamed for this. The industrialization of people occurs because mass production is driven by speed, volume, efficiency, cost, and the bottom line. For my listeners in the rest of the world, the bottom line means just the cheapest possible production, disregarding everything else. Thus, all over the world, we tend to use workers as machines, but these are human beings. Or we use them as simple cogs in a production machine. So this is the mechanization of people, driven by industrialization, and this process reduces the complex humanity of people to a single mechanistic function, which is what is needed for their particular role in the industrial complex. These contemporary trends have been analyzed and explored by the French-Canadian philosopher and author Olivier Dyens in his very nice book, Metal and Flesh. And he analyzes these trends underlying all of our culture. And when you read the book, you will see that it's more down than up. Now, the down and up classification is my own contribution in order to distinguish the two. Here is Ollivier Dyens' book. It exists in English and in French. Let us move to artificial life, which is the topic of this subsection. Artificial life was indeed achieved in the 20th century, but it was the opposite of what was expected. Everyone expected the elevation of machines to the level of humans or even of animals. And we have examples of that in the mobile robots that we see, in the high-capacity computers. However, we see instead, in terms of sheer numbers, what has happened is the reduction of animals and human beings to the level of machines. And that was not expected. This was an application of social engineering. And social engineering creates monsters from living beings. It manipulates the genetic information to create unnatural forms of life. Social engineering seeks to fundamentally reshape life forms so that they benefit industrial production and consumption. The aim is to fit life into a machine world. And everything I have mentioned now on this slide is clearly a process of going down, reducing living beings to machines. Well, enough of this digression. Let me go back to architecture. There are three levels of being human. The top level is the transcendent human being. Whether you are religious or not, most people accept that there is a higher level of existence for human beings, higher than other animals. We are sentient, we are compassionate, we have expressions. We may connect to the universe through religion, spirituality. Even if you don't believe that, we are the only human beings that understand the complexity of the universe. So that gives us a form of transcendence. The next lower level is the biological human being. The human being is another animal, which is wonderful in any case, because the biology of human beings is a marvelously complex mechanism. The lowest level of a human being is just the abstract mechanical human being, as some mobile entity that moves and reproduces and has no other level or reason for existence. This is the level that is used in industrialization, the mechanical human being, even though we know that the most complete, most fulfilling existence moves through all the three levels. I don't have to tell you of the number of profound thinkers who have demonstrated these three levels of human beings repeatedly. All the world's religious literature, all the world's philosophical literature, excepting that of the late 20th century, which tends to be nihilistic, accept that the existence of human beings goes through these three levels, and the most full existence actually has to accept all three levels. Therefore, to concentrate on the mechanical human being goes against human nature and all of nature. What is relevant to this lecture is that contemporary architecture and urbanism act strictly on level one, the abstract or mechanical human being, and this action is misnamed rationality. I discuss and I have introduced this three levels of being human in a chapter entitled Neuroscience, the Natural Environment, and Building Design, written with my friend Kenneth Masden, and that's chapter 5 of Biophilic Design, the Theory, Science, and Practice of Bringing Buildings to Life. It's a book that has just appeared. And here is the cover. Another chapter is by the distinguished biologist Edward Wilson, and there are articles by Stephen Kellert, Judith Heerwagen, many distinguished scientists and architects. Biophilic architecture respects human levels 2 and 3. That's the whole focus of the new movement. The architecture focuses on human feelings and psychology. This architecture is concerned primarily with human biology and sensitivities. Design is never imposed. There are no formal ideas that are ever imposed without testing their effects. And this type of design, biophilic design, rejects social engineering. Most architects today don't know about biophilic design. This is a new movement. So architects have, in the past century, accepted the machine aesthetic and its unnatural forms, which is the opposite direction from biophilic design. Architects have grown to love industrialization. They are among the most enthusiastic supporters of technological solutions to the built environment. Just turn on your television on a contemporary architecture program and hear the most respected award-winning architects of the world talk with passion about technology and technological solutions and how they apply technology in their buildings to build them even bigger and taller and make them, in my mind, less and less adaptable to human beings. But this is just to let you know that there is a frenzy, a passionate frenzy between contemporary architects and technology. The danger in all of this is that those architects don't know this when certain applications of technology reduce human beings to machines. And that's what I'm arguing against. Well, what happens when we reduce human beings to machines? Utopia then becomes dystopia. For my listeners, in the developing world, utopia is a dream of a perfect society that's not realizable. Dystopia is a hell on earth. It is unlivable conditions. So many times, social engineers have had a hopeful dream, and because of application of the wrong type of solutions, they have transformed the environment into a nightmare of dystopian despair. This has been recognized by science fiction authors, but not yet by our philosophers. Some of the best novels in science fiction paint such a terribly bleak doomsday picture of future societies where everything is bleak and people are unhappy and people today and in the past several decades have tended to ignore those as just entertaining science fiction without seeing the real dangers. For example, we have dystopia despair today, the high-rise slums all over the world. And I specifically mention high-rise slums because this is a certain typology that institutes despair because it is innately inhuman. There are dystopian urban regions all over the world, and you can usually find them as high-rise slums. This is not the same as the low-rise slums. I have written a paper with Andres Duany, Michael Mahaffey, and some friends on social housing and favelas in South America and the rest of the world. There is a different type of despair in those self-built slums, which are low-rise. The despair could be because people don't have enough to eat, sanitary conditions are terrible, but there is no architectural despair, because by building their own houses, they have full control over the environment. What I'm talking about, the dystopian despair, is the despair a person feels when they're put as a number into a cell in a high-rise building that becomes a prison for them, that destroys their family, detaching them from the world, that destroys children's connection with the earth, that destroys any form of human resemblance of human being. That's what I'm talking about, and that's what I would like to change. Now, moving on to the third part of this of today's talk, in human experiments. I have been talking about degrading humans to machines, and when human beings are degraded to machines, then atrocious actions become possible and even feasible, because you're no longer dealing with a human, you're dealing with a machine. Then the dominant idea of progress, as envisioned by social engineers, gets confused within human pursuits. They're ready to do things for people's own good, treating them as machines. I want to immediately point out that this is not true science, because it does not follow the scientific method. I'm a scientist and I know what the scientific method is. So what is the scientific method applied to human beings? I will review it right now. There is a protocol, a list of checkpoints for human experiments today. Human experiments are very carefully regulated by the government. First, the experiment is tried out on laboratory animals. Very thoroughly done on animals, and if it is safe and all the effects of the experiments are well understood to be safe, only then it is tried on volunteer human subjects. So there are two points here. First, checking with animals, then the human subjects are volunteers only. It is never forced on people. And needless to say, if there are any obvious signs that occur during the experiment that something is not going right, that the human beings are affected negatively, the experiment is immediately discontinued, and then a massive investigation is undertaken in order to see why there were negative results. Well, everyone knows this from just listening to the news, an informed individual. What is not as well known is the control group. The control group provides an additional check. Because we value human life so much, experiments on humans are always carried out with a control group. This is a separate group that is mixed in randomly with the experimental subjects. And suppose a drug is being tested. The best method is for the subjects themselves not to know which one is receiving the drug, the experimental drug, or receiving just aspirin or nothing at all, just a sugar pill. And the experimenters are continuously comparing the state of the subject with those in the control group. So even if no obvious harmful effect is seen in the experimental subjects, there may be a statistical effect that is negative. And what do I mean by that? Say there is a new medicine for checking heart attacks, and if after 2 years there are more heart attacks in the experimental group than in the control group, the experiment is terminated. It is not understood why there were more heart attacks, but because of the statistical correlation, then the experiment is terminated in order to find out what went on. So this is a separate and very important statistical control. Now that I have reviewed the protocol for human experiments, I will state categorically, as a scientist, that any experiment that ignores the established checks is an inhuman experiment, simply by definition. There are many experiments that have gone on in history and that are going on today that masquerade as scientific inquiry, and they're inhuman experiments. They are unconcerned with the fate of the subjects. The experimenter, however, will declare a noble intention. We have to do these experiments to solve the problems of humanity. Most often these experiments are carried out with detachment and indifference. We have a double standard for human experiments. The medical industry is held to strict standards for human experimentation. Those are the ones I just described. But architects and urbanists experiment freely on millions of humans without any controls or supervision. And the worst part of this is that even with massive evidence that something is not going well, typologies that are negative, that affect human beings negatively, continue to be marketed, continue to be built. Our cities continue to be filled with urban typologies and architectural typologies that affect us negatively. I will pick on one famous architect, but he's not the only one responsible. There are many in his generation, but just for the sake of argument, let us discuss Le Corbusier, which is the pseudonym he chose because he didn't like his own name, Charles-Édouard Jeanneret Gris. Le Corbusier designed in human environments for millions of people without ever considering their effects on the occupants. He was very creative in proposing far-ranging ideas for building and city form. It is astonishing that Le Corbusier was convinced of the absolute truth and moral value of his own inspiration, even though his ideas were never tested. One can only marvel at the arrogance he had. He never questioned the correctness of his schemes, but treated them as revealed wisdom, which is, to me, insulting because that's a religious presumption. It is not scientific. If you read Le Corbusier's writings, on every other page he appeals to science, saying how all his ideas are scientific. That's absolute nonsense. His ideas were never tested, and he never had any idea of how to test them and never showed any interest in testing them. Yet, despite all of this, they replied repeatedly for the last several decades. Here are some points from his architecture and his urbanism. Architecture of the horizontal, anti-gravity anxiety, overhanging slabs. I mentioned these points in lecture 2 of the series. Flat or tilted plane ceilings and roofs, the randomization of tectonic forms for no reason, use of rough exterior materials for indoor surfaces that creates anxiety, and his predilection for brutalist concrete finished in a rough way so that when you touch it you scrape the skin of your hands. He followed Adolf Loos in forbidding ornament from buildings. He banished complex and natural colors. Whenever he had some colors in his own buildings, these were just the primary colors, but most of the time they were just gray concrete or pure white. He forced people into high-rise buildings. He disconnected families from nature. He disconnected children from the earth. He destroyed urban space by gigantism, totally missed the whole point of urban space. And he erased the human scale of the streets so as to stop human interaction of the streets. Now, why did humans build cities several 100,000 years ago? Humans did not build cities. Humans came together to live together because they like to interact. And where do humans interact? Humans interact in the street. So if you kill the street and street life, you're killing the city. You're killing the idea of the city and its reason to exist in the first place. This is what Le Corbusier did, and people accepted it. In the estimation of my friends, Le Corbusier invented a vocabulary of forms, all of which provoke anxiety. Those 13 points that I've listed, all of them provoke anxiety. Yet they're used as standard design typologies. They're brilliantly effective in provoking anxiety, and they're consistent. So this is not accidental. He did it on purpose. He defined a rational world based upon psychological anxiety. Just 2 quick examples. Le Corbusier planned a hospital for Venice with no windows at all. Somehow he had this idea that this would be an excellent hospital. But from Biophilia, the book I just mentioned, we know that healing environments absolutely require sunlight and views of nature. And experiments have been done that show vastly improved healing when people have access to nature and sunlight. So this hospital, which I don't believe was ever built, would have condemned these patients to get even more sick. his apartment block, the Unité d'Habitation in France, he had extra thin walls which create a terrible noise problem. In addition, there is a terrible glare from the light, etc. Everything is wrong. There are these are awful dark corridors. The elevator stop only every other stairwell, etc., etc. Everything is wrong. You can say, well, he may have saved the concrete. That's not true. He wasted an enormous amount of concrete in building these sculptural elements and the columns upon which these apartment blocks rest. So he wasted the material and compromised the lives of the inhabitants. Wasn't Le Corbusier a religious architect? Well, he was commissioned by Father Marie-Alain Couturier, who regarded Le Corbusier as the greatest living architect. So there are three churches in Le Corbusier's name. The convent of the Saint-Marie de la Tourette, which was actually designed by Yannis Xenakis, but Le Corbusier took all the credit. Also, Xenakis did the Phillips Pavilion, and Corbusier took all the credit, but that's another story. The Church of Notre-Dame du Haut in Ronchamp, that's extremely well known. It's in all the architecture books. And the Church of Saint-Pierre de Firminy, which was incomplete for many, many years, and it was just completed now. However, when Corbusier is ranked as a great religious architect, people don't mention his participation in the Palace of the Soviets in Moscow in 1931. The land to build the Palace of the Soviets was obtained by dynamiting the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which was a perfectly sound building. It was working. It was a functioning cathedral, one of the most glorious cathedrals in Moscow, and Joseph Stalin dynamited it and bulldozed aside in order to build the Palace of the Soviets. And Le Corbusier and other famous modernist architects eagerly participated in the competition. As a moral person, I am abhorred by this, but that's for everyone to decide on an individual basis. Back to urbanism. Le Corbusier really was obsessed with erasing street life and daily human interaction. Here's a quote: "We must kill the street," written by Sybil Moholy-Nagy in her book. So one must wonder, are Le Corbusier's ideas an expression of his psychological problems? I'm not in a position to answer that. I'm not a clinical psychiatrist. But I have here a little tidbit of information that will help anyone who will address this problem clinically. Le Corbusier had the skin of his dog used to bind his favorite book, Cervantes' Don Quixote. And this is documented in this book by Catherine de Smet. You draw your own conclusions. Pauvre pinceau. Now, we're not finished with Le Corbusier. He was obsessed with destroying Algiers for some reason. This is the capital of Algeria. He collaborated with a Nazi-supported Vichy regime, urging Marshal Pétain to destroy Algiers during the war. Pétain despised Le Corbusier and refused to meet with him and did not do anything. But after the war, Le Corbusier convinced the post-war French occupation authority to destroy Algiers, which they did. It's interesting why so many people who had worked for the Vichy regime were tried and shot after the war, but Le Corbusier was up there, very high-ranking, great architect after the war ended. Now, why did Le Corbusier pick on Algiers? Nobody knows, but Algiers is a Muslim city. It encapsulates the complexity of traditional Islamic urbanism. Le Corbusier showed a fanatical hostility against this. Nobody knows why. But the Arab Islamic world has noticed this and has never forgiven the West. This is the feedback I get from my Arab Islamic friends. It is worth noting that somebody in the news after 2001, Mohammed Atta, was an urbanist. He wrote his thesis on the modernist urban destruction of Aleppo, ancient town in Syria. Atta was absolutely disgusted and turned against the West by studying how Corbusian type of ideas had destroyed his own city, Cairo, and the traditional Islamic urban fabric around the world. Le Corbusier published a book containing all his plans for destroying Algiers, and he made a drawing for the front. And the drawing is a drawing of the angel of death. Very curious. And this drawing represents or resembles representations of Satan found in various images from different cultures throughout history. Well, I know this is getting away from the subject of the talk, but I couldn't resist. So here is a sketch of the Demon Pazuzu from Iraq, 500 BC. Note the animal head, the lion's head and lion's claws, and the wings. Here is a medieval representation of Satan as an androgynous goat, which means Satan has wings, has the head of a goat and the horns, and has the body of a man and a goat, but female breasts. And here's Le Corbusier's own drawing for the cover of his book on plans to destroy Algiers. And the title is very interesting little title, very innocuous title, a poetry on the topic of Algiers. Le Corbusier drew his own hand, like the hand of God, holding the angel of death. The body of the angel is female. The head is a goat or a sheep with horns, and the wings that we have seen earlier. All of this is an interesting coincidence. And now let's leave Le Corbusier and go on to what happened after him. Things only got worse, I'm afraid. Contemporary buildings go far beyond Le Corbusier's own buildings in producing anxiety. In the past few decades, we have seen a descent into even more inhuman architectural experiments. Some new art museums assault the senses, causing nausea and vertigo. I have to be careful not to offend anybody, but those who read the newspapers know that people have fallen on the floor after vomiting in some of the new art museums and have to be carried out and take several hours for them to regain because of the vertigo induced by the architecture of these new museums. Novel and human experiments in architecture extend the sensual assault of blank, forbidding concrete or glass walls, which were all the 20th century architects dared to use. But the new architects go even further by using blobs, oozing forms, translucent walls, curvilinear, shiny metal surfaces, zigzags, and spikes. All of these tectonic typologies generate user anxiety, but no one cares. Indeed, the more anxiety is generated, the more likely such a building is to win an architectural award. And compare anxiety-producing versus life-enhancing geometries in architecture. Our generation has chosen anxiety-producing and has abandoned and is fast destroying the life-enhancing geometries of the past. There is media collusion in this movement. Architecture critics write intelligent but false arguments that praise inhuman design experiments. They use the language of technology to erase human feelings about form and place, and they disguise or deny the anxiety those forms generate. Therefore, the media today is successful in convincing the rest of the world to eagerly import fashionable designs. This is a tremendous propaganda coup. Much of the world wants to advance to reach the level of the most industrialized countries, namely the United States and Western Europe. They have been sold the image of this type of anxiety-inducing architecture as the key to modernization. So what do? They destroy their own cultural heritage, architectural and urban heritage, in order to build these new forms believing falsely that they will lead to improvement in the society. Here is an award-winning theater, which can only be described as sadistic. The important action of the market is that these pathologies are market-driven. We have no totalitarian dictatorship that forces these horrible buildings on the world. People want these buildings. Our consumer society is passively masochistic. They want to be made anxious because they believe what the media and academic authority has told them. Therefore, clients commission such buildings. They pay good money to live in a building that makes them ill at ease. Museum goers buy an entrance ticket to feel nauseous in an art museum. This is done by consent, so it is market-driven. Why is such an inhuman ideology moving around the world and erasing architectural traditions? Well, as I said, either governments force this on their people, not in a totalitarian way, but the government will choose a showcase new building, say for an important national event. They will choose an architect that is known to create anxiety-inducing buildings, and they will ask them. They will commission the building, and they will say, well, we're doing it for our country's good, for our own people's good, because this is a very famous architect, and this is good contemporary architecture. So they do that, and many people welcome this as progress. At the same time that this type of architecture is an aggression towards humanistic traditional architectures. Can we contrast the nourishment people get from architecture? There's a certain type of architecture which my friends and I are promoting, and that is morally nourishing. It nourishes the human being through life-enhancing qualities of pattern, color, geometry, and rhythm. This gives satisfaction for the user. Not only aesthetic satisfaction, but biological. A feeling of well-being that is measurable in biological terms, physiological terms. Nevertheless, we cannot deny that architecture can also bring out the darkest regions of the human soul, and that does give a satisfaction for a certain type of architect. The darkest regions of the human soul, if you scratch under our so-called civilized exterior, you find nihilism, schizophrenia, sadism, and power. And those can also be expressed in architecture, and they give satisfaction for architects who build such buildings. My plea is to stop inhuman experiments, and that can be done overnight. We simply require the same standards as with medical human experiments. Control groups. But architects are not interested in the effects of the creation. We live in a dogma of abstract form, and that rules the profession and academia, and certainly the media. So I don't expect any change from inside the profession, and I don't expect any change from academia, and certainly not from the media. The development towards a more human architecture can only occur if it is market-driven. Therefore, we need to educate the clients. It's the clients who have to refuse to commission inhuman, anxiety-inducing buildings and insist on creating buildings that give physical and psychological nourishment to their users. Which brings me to the last part of this talk. Everything is going to depend upon architectural education, because we are training the architects of the future. Why are we training our students to design buildings detached from nature? I would like to put back the component of integrity into architecture schools. I wish to resituate in academia and the media an obligation towards human beings. I wish to reorient design in a totally different direction from the spectacular image and towards the feelings of human beings. Now, architecture schools are teaching courses in algorithmic design, which is a new interest. This lecture series is on algorithmic design. But if you notice that this is algorithmic design with a biophilic viewpoint and certain controls, algorithmic design without any of these constraints can create monsters, because we don't know how people are going to respond to those buildings when built. A biophilic worldview will guarantee designs that are integral with natural systems. It is very easy to create inhuman algorithmic design because you can generate anxiety and disguise it as a celebration of novelty, the search for playful abstract forms. You take cute results of geometrical algorithm and you use them to design an inhuman building or urban region. No human constraints are applied, like biophilia, adaptivity, and pattern languages, which is the topic of all these lectures, how to apply these constraints. One example of thousands I could show of a very cute design that's unbuilt. When you build it, will people feel like this is a hell on earth to inhabit this building? Nobody has taken the time to find out. Well, I would like architecture schools to start teaching students to create novel forms while thinking about the inhabitants. What they do now is they teach students to create novel forms without thinking about the future inhabitants. Architecture schools today promote architecture as a sculptural art that is never meant for human occupation. It is just a game. And a game does not care. It is oblivious of the moral responsibility for the designs. The famous name architects don't make things better, they make things worse, because they invariably deny the human qualities. Famous architects now manipulate forms while ignoring living beings. And architecture schools follow these famous architects, and they teach students values based upon buildings as totemic objects, objects of worship, without any human beings in them. You may say, well, I'm being extreme in my alarm. Certainly human beings have an innate integrity that will stop young architects from mindlessly practicing an inhuman architecture. We are all feeling compassionate human beings, so that will stop a young architectural graduate from doing what I have zeroed on as inhuman architecture. Do we have cause to be optimistic? I claim not. And to argue my case, I'm going to go into some psychological experiments. Philip Zimbardo is a psychologist at Stanford University, and he undertook the Stanford Prison Experiment several years ago. He took ordinary students and paid them, and by random selection, chose half of them to be so-called guards in a basement mock prison in Stanford University, and the other half to be so-called prisoners, and just to observe the psychological interaction. Well, the students who had been selected to be the guards turned into sadistic psychopaths, abused the prisoner students. There was even a sexual harassment. These were all male students. Things got so out of hand that Zimbardo ended the experiment after a week. This was one of the most astonishing experiments ever done. A similar experiment was performed by Stanley Milgram, where he got students to administer lethal electric shocks to a volunteer. And here's how that experiment went. Stanley Milgram had an actor playing the role of somebody who's been questioned, and whenever he got an answer wrong, he was supposed to be zapped with a mild electric shock. And the student was sitting next to the experimenter, and the experimenter was dressed as a doctor in a lab coat, and each time was telling the student, increase the voltage and zap the volunteer. And so the actor would start screaming, and yet the student would ask, well, can I continue? This person seems to be in great pain. And the experimenter would say, no, don't worry, just continue. So based on that authority, the student would give a lethal electric shock, not knowing that, of course, there was no current. All this was a mock-up. But the student could see that the dial said lethal electric shock, and yet he would still push the button to zap the volunteer. If you do not know this, then you certainly know the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Baghdad. Because of his experience in the Stanford prison experiment, Zimbardo was asked by the US government to investigate the Abu Ghraib atrocities. And his findings are just as shocking as the atrocities themselves. He found that the people who committed the atrocities, the US soldiers that committed the atrocities, were just ordinary human beings, and any other people were just as capable of committing these atrocities because they believed they were following authority. So this is absolutely shocking, and the conclusions for architecture are the following: that there is no innate human mechanism to prevent someone inflicting atrocities on other human beings. If they believe they're following orders, if they believe that they're authorized to do so, that they're doing the right thing. We have seen this over and over again in horrible atrocities committed during the history of humanity, where humanity sinks to the lowest possible level. There is no fail-safe mechanism. In order to apply this now to the future of architecture, I think that we should stop training architecture students to create anxiety-producing forms and to destroy our cities. It is us, the authority of this generation, that is training these young people. Instead, we have to reverse the process before it is too late, before they go out and start producing sadistic buildings. We need to train them to accept responsibility for their designs. And how do we train them? Well, I'm doing the best I can by making material available, techniques. Here is a collection of techniques that is meant for architectures, young architects and architecture students. It is a trilogy, 3 articles written by Kenneth Masden and myself. They go together. The first article is entitled Architecture, Biological Form and Artificial Intelligence. The second article is entitled Restructuring 21st Century Architecture Through Human Intelligence. And the third article is entitled Intelligence-Based Design, a Sustainable Foundation for Worldwide Architectural Education. We have put a lot of effort in this, plus all the techniques that I have mentioned in this series of lectures. I firmly believe that if a young student today follows what I have indicated in the lectures and follows up all the books that I have given as references, reads the trilogy, the Intelligence-Based Design trilogy, and a considerable amount of material that presently exists, that will hopefully prevent them from becoming an anti-human architect. That will hopefully turn them towards a new respect for human well-being and the human existence. And such an architect then can create novel forms, the most extravagant novel forms, but then adjust those forms with the constraints I have mentioned. This is the whole point of algorithmic sustainable design. I have given the algorithm how to adjust the forms at every step. So you can create the most extravagant forms like Antoni Gaudí did in Barcelona, and you adjust them. So it's to give nourishment and pleasure to the inhabitants. That's what architecture has to be, and architecture has gone so far away from that. It has become the opposite. It has become a sadistic pursuit by people who I would not say on purpose, but it has become like that. But on purpose or otherwise, the end result is still the same, unfortunately. So I'm calling for nothing less than a new approach to architecture and education. We need to use human intelligence to design and build the most humane environments. We need to utilize the most recent scientific knowledge about human well-being. And we need to respect level 3 in my classification, which is the spiritual level of human beings, something that is denied as existing today by many contemporary architects. In order to achieve this new approach, we have to introduce opposite methods from the formal and image-based design which are taught in architecture schools today. So this is calling for a major restructuring of architectural education. To conclude, pressing priorities are to teach students why a cute design on the computer screen can become a monster when it is actually built. At the moment, there is no discussion of the transference of a design from a computer screen to a building, and how the positive qualities can turn into monstrously negative qualities. It is the student's responsibility to learn techniques for evaluating the effects that their designs will have on human beings. It is not the responsibility of the teachers, it is the responsibility of the student, because it is the student who will go out into the world and practice these designs. And finally, we need a new design integrity. And integrity the word has two meanings, and I mean both of those meanings. First, there's a moral integrity, and second is the natural integrity. Moral integrity is that a young architect will do things that are consistent with humanity, culture, civilization, doing no harm, doing only good. Certainly doing no harm because they're forced to do so by some authority. That's the same as those horrible psychological experiments that I just mentioned. Natural integrity is just as important. What we build must be integral with the biological world and the natural world. What we have been building in the last several decades is totally contrary to the biological and natural worlds. It is an intrusion. It is destructive to the natural world. I know that the word sustainability is very popular now, but I think that most of those high-tech architects who say that they're doing sustainable buildings, this is just a sham and a cover-up. True sustainability must arise from the earth. It must be integral in a mathematical way with natural and biological systems. The only way to achieve sustainable buildings in that fundamental and deep sense is to follow the techniques that I'm outlining in this series of lectures, which are practiced by my group of friends and traditional architects all around the world. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you next time.